right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. Today we have Drs. Robert Silbergleit and Jordan Elm on the call to present on their presentation specific aims. Please note that while we normally provide CMEs for these presentations, we are currently not approved for CMEs yet. We hope to be approved for future webinars. This webinar will be posted online on the CTMC webinar website. I'll post a link to the chat in that. Typically takes a few days for us to get that up. And we will also be posting a link to a survey once we are completed. And we would appreciate for everybody to provide feedback so that we can improve future webinars. All right, thank you so much. I will turn it over to Dr. Silbergleit.
Okay, great. Well, I have some slides and Jordan has some slides, and I think that we'll reserve a lot of the time for discussion, though. I think that this session usually does well if a lot of the discussion takes place as question and answer. So let me just say that there are a lot of things that I think I might have been asked to speak on, which I could claim more expertise on than this. The only credentials that I really bring to this talk involve having served for several years on NINDS NSDK study section and a lot of other study sections since then. But NSDK is the section that reviews all the Institute's clinical trials. So I think that's helpful. In that role, I had the opportunity to read a lot of specific aims pages. So I'm familiar with the range of what folks do, and I've seen positive and negative reactions from reviewers to what folks do. So I've also written a few specific aims pages for grants, some of which got good reviews and were funded, and more that got poor reviews and were not. So I have a little bit of credential there too. I have no disclosures specific to this talk. In terms of the objectives, this could be one of the shorter webinars in the series. We're going to talk about what makes the specific aims page so important. I think that everyone would agree on this, but I don't think it can be overemphasized. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why it's so important. So we'll talk a little bit about what I think are some of the hardest parts of writing good specific aims. There are a lot of things that make writing a good specific aims hard, but most of them are obvious, are obviously going to be project specific. What we're going to talk about are the things that I can tell you to help with specific aims pages in general. That said, there are a couple of common stylistic elements that are hard to achieve, but really improve a specific aims page. Then I'll suggest a proposed structure or template for the page. That'll be something upon which there's not universal agreement, but I'll tell you what I like. Then we'll use the balance of the time to talk about your questions and concerns. There also at the end, there will be a link to a PDF with some specific examples, specific aims pages that were collected by the course a number of years ago and can be used as a basis for discussion if needed. So the specific aims page is your big chance to make an elevator pitch for the grant you're proposing. And there are at least 3 really good reasons why it's so important. The first is that a lot of people are going to read only your specific aims page. I know that's discouraging, but this is because how the NIH review process works. Your grant is going to go to a review panel of maybe 20 people or more, all of whom will ultimately vote a score for your application. 2 or more will be assigned as the primary and secondary reviewers, and there may be a tertiary and statistical reviewer assigned. The primary and secondary reviewers, and probably the other assigned reviewers, will reliably read your entire grant from snout to tail. They'll read it thoroughly, they'll understand it, I hope, and they may or may not read your appendices, which they're not obligated to. The other 15 plus folks, though, on the grant app that are going to vote on your application are probably not going to read it at all. They'll hear about your grant application in a presentation by the primary and secondary reviewers. The additional reviewers will add comments. Then there's going to be a discussion among the whole panel. Typically during the presentation among the whole panel, the other members of the committee will bring up your application on their computer screen, and maybe they'll have it printed out. Certainly in the old days they did. And then they're going to start browsing through it. And likely that'll be the first time that they've actually looked at it. Some might have read it ahead of time just because they were interested. but they were assigned other grant applications, and that's what they're going to have done mostly in preparation for the meeting. And the thing they're going to look at when they just bring it up in the meeting to preliminary look at it is mostly your specific aims page. So that's your moment. That's your chance in that room to sell those other 15 plus people that are going to vote on your idea, independently of what the reviewers have said. And that might be all they look at, or they might skim some other elements. Different folks do different things. Some might flip to your figures or your methods section, but everyone's probably going to read your specific aims page for the first time right there. And like I said, although the assigned reviewers may be the only ones who read your application all the way through, everyone on the panel votes. And no one's vote counts more than anyone else's votes. So your specific aims page is your chance to present to the majority of the panel. So the second reason that the specific aims page is important is related to what this guy says. And now, many years ago, I wouldn't have needed to say who this guy was. Everyone would have recognized this as Will Rogers. Nowadays, I sort of have to tell people because everybody's younger. Will Rogers is gone. So, but Will Rogers is famous for saying a lot of different things. But one of the things that he's famous for saying is that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And there's no question that that's true about your specific aims page as well. So independent of all the folks who only read your specific aims page, even your reviewers, who you really have to sell to, everyone's going to read your page once first. And what we know is that, and this isn't just homespun wisdom from Will Rogers, cognitive science tells us that he was absolutely right, and that this is actually how people think. Most people make decisions in a fast thinking, snap judgment way. They read something quickly, they look at it, they form an opinion, and then they spend whatever additional time they have on the matter trying to rationalize and justify the decision they've already made. So your chance to get the reviewer hooked, interested, engaged, and excited about your project comes from this initial look at the specific aims page. If you get them interested, they'll spend the rest of the time reading your application looking for reasons to like it and support it. If on their first glance, though, at your specific aims page, they're disinterested, bored, confused, then they're going to read the rest of your grant application looking for reasons to not approve it or not like it or score it badly. So there's no question that the first impression is the hook, and it's the key. The third reason that the specific aims page I think is so important is that it's sort of the page that people will read the most often. And what I mean by that is that what I do as a reviewer, and I think many other reviewers do as well, is use the specific aims page as a map for the 12 pages that follow. So you start getting into the 12 pages of the project, and they're dense and they're detailed and they're data laden and methodologically complex. And when you get sort of lost, you say to yourself, what exactly are they trying to do here? And then I go back to the specific aims page to try to figure it out and remind myself exactly what the applicant is saying and how it relates to the question being answered. So if you can provide that map in your specific aims page well, if you make it clear there, then everything else you're going to unpack in the next 12 pages relates to that goal, to that purpose. Then the reviewer can use that sort of repeatedly to understand what you want them to understand. Additionally, the reviewer is going to go back to your specific aims page when they go to fill out their review in the summary statement form. And they'll have to answer the questions on, what it is about your proposal that is significant, what's the innovation, et cetera, to the extent that you can give them in a clear, concise statement that explicitly answers the scoring criteria questions for them, anywhere in the application actually, but especially good on the specific aims page, then you're making it easier for them to give you a more positive review. So if I can find in the specific aims statement, this is innovative because ... then I can just go and cut and paste that into my review. So, you've made my day. One thing you want to do when you're trying to, one thing you're always trying to do anywhere in the application, but on your specific aims page in particular, is to make life easier for your reviewer. A happier reviewer is more likely to give you a happy score. So those are the reasons I think it's really important. So with that being said, I want to talk about what I think are what is so hard about writing a good specific aims page. So obviously, given what I just said about how important it is, it's sort of clear what's hard. You've got just one page to summarize your whole project and clearly explain all the complexity and nuance that you've worked out for the past 6 to 12 months or longer. and get it right and get it clear and get it detailed and get it exciting and get everything else. So that's incredibly hard just by itself. So equally obvious is that the hardest parts are all going to be project specific and they're going to differ from each other. So that's just inherently hard, and I can't tell you how to do the thing that's specific to your project. But what I can do maybe is emphasize a couple of general concepts that are specifically hard to do when writing. And by recognizing these concepts and making them explicit, the hope is that you'll tackle them head on rather than just subconsciously ignoring them and because they're hard. So I want to talk about the narrative of the specific aims page and then provide some observations on focus. So with regard to the narrative, a narrative is by definition a spoken or written account of connected events. And so it's a story, really. And the specific aims pages should really be a story. It should flow, it should take the reader on a journey that will get them excited and take them to the resolution where they all want to get your grant funded and learn how it all ends. So it's the story part that gets the reviewers engaged. And that might sound a little different from what others have told you. And you may say, gosh, that's not what I heard. I heard this specific aims page is supposed to be like an elevator pitch. But really, that's exactly the same thing, because an elevator pitch is also a story. And this is the classic elevator pitch sentence structure that you'll find in any Business 101 class. And the sentence structure says, for a certain customer who has a certain need, I've got this product in this category that has some really great purpose, unlike anything you ever have now. And that's really a story too. You got a main character, the target customer, and the target customer has a problem, which is a crisis. And lo and behold, a hero comes, a product that has certain powers and abilities that's going to save the day, save the world, vanquish the competition, and save the target customer so that she can live happily ever after. So it's a story that you can think about in the form of a pitch sentence, or if you want, you can think about it in terms of sort of the classic sense of a narrative arc. So if you've ever taken a creative writing class, or even just a purveyor of popular fiction and movies, you'll recognize this. You'll see this pattern, which is almost how all simple stories work. You know, some with the exception of, you know, some David Lynch movies or Kurt Vonnegut novels or Beckett plays. But it almost always, you know, certainly any Star Trek episode starts with an exposition that sets the scene, then something goes wrong and there's a complication, and then the complication gets worse, and finally reaching some climactic crisis in which the hero somehow overcomes, leading to a resolution of the problem and usually a newer and better world. So this can really map out directly to what you can write on a specific aims page. So the specific aims page is going to start out with some kind of background. Here's what the problem is or what the disease is, and then there's a specific challenge. If we could only know this biomarker or this biological mechanism or treat this aspect of the disease, we'll be able to make a difference. And that leads to an overarching goal of the project, the crisis, and then there is a hero that comes in with a specific solution to answer this problem. And by the way, in a specific aims page, that hero is you, right? You're the one who's going to come in and save the day with these specific aims. And you're going to vanquish this problem and lead to an impact, an innovation in patient care where wonderful things are going to happen for these people that were suffering before. So that's the story you want to tell. And we'll get back to this when we talk about the structure, but that really works. Now I want to stop and talk about focus a little bit, because this is sometimes even harder to get right. And of course, some parts of focus are easy. The specific aims page focuses on the specific aims, right? If this blue-gray guy represents the specific aims statements themselves in your application, then it's not hard to tell that he's out of focus. If you invest your time, energy, wordsmithing to be explicit and precise, crystal clear, to eliminate any ambiguity and remove the barriers to understanding it, then you'll bring the aims themselves into focus. And I think everyone would agree with that. I think that's pretty doable. That's not the hardest part of getting focus. The hardest part of focus is that the aims themselves are not the only part that has to be in focus. There's also this sort of big picture, the impact. And the impact has to not only be there, but you have to sell it with enough granularity so that people can really see it and believe it. And then there also has to be a backstory. There has to be just enough methodologic detail so that people can start to trust that you have the ability to accomplish this, even on this very, very limited page. So ultimately, you need to have every part of this page be sort of in focus, from your statement of problems to your solution to your aims and your impact. So nothing on the page is a gimme. To make an analogy to photography, you're creating a depth of field by carefully balancing your lighting, your shutter speed, your choice of film, and all your resources, right? The aims themselves are the center of your focus, but people have to be able to clearly understand the stuff around it as well. And that's really challenging, and it requires writing and rewriting as much as is needed. This is the one page of your grant application that you need to share with others, with colleagues, with friends, folks who work in the area that you're working in, but also those who don't, because the panel won't be all subspecialists in your topic. It wouldn't hurt to have friends and family who are lay read this as well, and just, see if it makes any sense to them. This is just one page that you want to continue to revise until it's just as good as you can possibly get it. So now I'm going to suggest a specific structure for you for a specific aims page. And a lot of what I told you so far is really subjective, but this part of the talk that I'm talking about is even more purely a matter of opinion. This is what I do when I write these pages. If you look online, you can find some other templates. I think this is pretty similar to a lot of what you'll find online, but everybody has their own preferences. There's no single correct right way to write a specific aims page. Roughly speaking, this is the structure that I suggest for a specific aims page. It really looks like the basic structure of an essay that you were taught in middle school or high school. It's, an introduction that's an upside down triangle that, starts generally and goes to a narrow thesis statement, and then a body, usually in 3 parts, just like we were taught in middle school, and then a conclusion. And the introduction starts broadly and then, like I said, narrows to become more focused on the topic. I suggest this be about maybe a quarter of the page. The extended thesis statement is your idea, your goal, and your purpose. This is probably a quarter of the page or less. Then the body is the actual specific aims themselves. And that's maybe another quarter to a third of a page. And then the rest of the page is this conclusion triangle that builds from your specific focus to the broader impact that you're going to have. So that's the summary. The specific aims page is critical. It's hard to do, but if you tell a story and you get the focus just right, you can really have a huge impact on the success of your grant application. And consider using some kind of template. And this link is the link to, I don't remember how many we have, something like 4 maybe specific aims pages out of grants from that have, I think they're all grants that succeeded in the past. So that's my nutshell, and pass it on to Jordan to tell you a little bit more from the statistician's reviewer's perspective.
Thanks, Robert. Can you advance the slides for me?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I'm a biostatistician. So I'm one of those reviewers that looks at grants. Really, mostly I'm looking at the approach and the significance. And I will, statisticians will read the specific aims page is probably one of the first things that we look at. So, understanding, having that brief paragraph where you can understand the significance from that is very helpful. But the main thing that I'm looking at it to understand is kind of what is the design, so as I'm going in to look at the approach, I'm getting a very brief understanding of the design in a nutshell, kind of. But the other thing that I will evaluate typically is looking for consistency between what you say in your specific aims and what is written in the analysis plan. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of times there is inconsistencies, and those suggest that either there's some misunderstanding between, the PI and the statistician, or there is, some kind of like, there's a problem there, right? If you think you're doing one thing, but your analysis is not matching that, then that's problematic. You can go to the next slide. Can you advance, Robert or Courtney? Thank you. So yeah, the first thing is, first things first, trying to understand what's the research question. So getting that from the specific aims, and really, what is usually outlined in the specific aims is the hypotheses in scientific terms, not so much statistical terms. Now, sometimes those are the same, but typically it's written in a scientific way. So it's kind of like what I would think of as your, alternative hypothesis, which you're trying to prove. Sometimes you might give an overarching hypothesis, but that might be, for example, oftentimes, if you're doing like a phase 1 or phase 2 trial, you might want to state what your overarching hypothesis is for future research, right? But you also want to be very clear and state what you're specifically testing or estimating in this, given grant proposal. So I like to see the aims written in a way in which you're kind of describing the population, you're describing what you're comparing, and you are describing the response variable that you're measuring, so that it's clear. So you want to kind of avoid some of the jargon. If you can go to the next slide, I think I say that better next. Yes. So so basically, the big thing for statisticians is understanding what you're measuring. So stating your outcome. So for example, that you don't want to just say, I want to show that this treatment slows decline of Parkinson's disease. You want to be clear about how you're measuring slowing decline. Or it's fine to use the jargon, but as long as you can define it, because it's not going to just be people from your field that are looking at that page. So for example, if you want to say, I want to show that this improves functional independence as measured by a modified Rankin scale of less than or equal to 2, whatever, however you've defined it, so that it's clear to everyone who's looking at that exactly what you mean. The next slide, please. Okay, so I alluded to this before, but basically, when you're doing a specific aims page for a phase 3 trial, those are pretty easy, right? You're comparing 2 groups, you want to show one's better than the other. But oftentimes when you're writing a phase 2 trial, or even a phase 1 trial, those specific aims get very tricky to write in a way in which you're not being inconsistent with your analysis. You can only say so much at the end of a futility design, right? You can only say, well, either we found that the treatment was futile, or we failed to find that the treatment was futile. And that doesn't imply that the treatment works, right? So this is where it gets very tricky to write sometimes your specific aims with consistency with your analysis. So it's important that you don't, it's important that you show that page to your statistical collaborator, and that you make sure that they are in agreement with kind of how it's worded. And then if you do make last minute changes or you're wordsmithing things, just run that back by your statistician to make sure that doesn't impact the analysis, because sometimes things have to be worded very precisely. Now, I'm not talking about the first paragraph or the last paragraph. I'm just really specifically talking about your aims. So the other thing that you want to kind of be, so I think I've given another example there about one aim is in terms of, like, let's say your aim is to demonstrate safety. But if you're doing a very small trial, That's a very vague aim, and it's probably not something that you can evaluate definitively. So you need to be kind of more clear about how you're going to be evaluating safety in this context, and then what that means ultimately. Then the next slide, please. Okay, and then I just wanted to just throw this up there. I think, Robert and I have fairly different opinions about exploratory aims. Usually people will have like a third aim, perhaps it's an exploratory aim. I think that's one of the things that people have a lot of different opinions on. I was always trained that each aim should have a power analysis associated with it, but some people will understand that if you label it exploratory, that therefore you're kind of basically saying it's not going to be powered. But by nature, an exploratory aim is going to have less rigor because it isn't powered. So I tend to not particularly like them. That being said, I'm not going to, if everything else in a grant looks good, I'm not going to bring that up as a critique, that they had an underpowered exploratory aim. That's not something that I would put, but other people might. So I think that's where it can be a little bit of a hard to know whether it's good to include that or not. And I think that was my last slide. Yeah. So I think that was everything. I'm just trying to look through my notes and make sure. Yes. Robert, I don't know if you want to give your perspective on exploratory aims. I know you had kind of a different perspective than me.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well. My feeling is so that especially when you're doing clinical trials, there's usually not a lot of aims. You don't want to have too many aims in any kind of grant application, but especially in a clinical trials application, what are your aims going to be? The first aim is going to be something like efficacy, and the second aim may be something like safety. And then you could just stop there. But usually there's a bunch of things that you're going to learn from that clinical trial that you hope to learn that are not the primary goals of it. And I think that's where an exploratory aim is really helpful. If there are, you don't have to put it in just to have, but if in fact you think that even if you don't show efficacy and you don't show and you show safety but you don't show efficacy, you show efficacy but there's a safety signal, but you think that there's things that you will inevitably learn that will end up being meaningful and important and advance the field, even if the trial isn't successful in the first place. And if that's really an important part of why you want to do the project, that's why an exploratory aim makes sense. So I don't think you want to, do it just for laughs. But a lot of times, a trial is, especially if you're one of the first trials in a particular niche or space, there's just going to be a lot of things that are going to be learned, even if the one thing that you test that you powered on turns out not to be useful. So that's why I think it's helpful. But yeah, it comes with a lot of liabilities as well. If the only thing that the person likes about your study is the exploratory aim, they're going to say, I like the exploratory aim, but of course it's just an exploratory aim, it's underpowered. They're not going to be able to show that really. So that's not going to save, it's not going to save the day for you. So it's just like Jordan says, it's not going to, she's not going to kill the application because it has an exploratory aim. It's also probably not going to save the day for you. So it's sort of a, it's either going to add a little bit or detract a little bit. I think it has the potential to add a little more than detract on average. So I like it, but I agree with everything that Jordan said as well. Beyond that, I think that, in terms of how you do the aims, I think that a lot of times the way to balance what Jordan was saying, I don't like having 3 specific aims where aim 1 has hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, hypothesis 3. I think that gets really burdensome very quickly. My preference, and again, depends on the specifics of the project, is to have a sort of brief statement of purpose for the aim, that this is, the efficacy aim, and I'm going to try to show that this works here, and then follow that with a testable hypothesis that's clear and exactly what the measure is and exactly what difference you're looking at in between what groups. And that tends to be a longer sentence. Try to get it as short as possible, but a long sentence that has all those elements. But if you can bullet it with the short version, this first aim is to find out if it works, and what works means is the difference between these two groups on this measure will be at least this, with this much certainty.
Yeah, and the other downside of having like a lot of subcomponents to aim 1A, aim 1B, aim 1C, aim 2A, etc., is it looks like you have potentially a lot of analyses that perhaps you haven't adjusted your alpha for, and I mean, to me that's always kind of a red flag. I know that people do organize their aims that way, and sometimes it's just fine. But it can be also a little burdensome, I think, to read. Do you want to pull up the examples, or are there questions that people have?
There aren't any questions in the Q&A. If you would like to use the Q&A feature, you're welcome to, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you.
Here's Q&A.
You mentioned that phase 2 is more difficult than phase 3. How about phase 1? How do you avoid vague safety endpoints in exploratory analysis in an underpowered proof of concept phase 1?
Oh, that is a great question. So phase 2, I feel like phase 2 is the hardest because it's usually the type of study where you're starting to look at preliminary efficacy, but you typically are doing so in a way that's not definitive. So it can be very awkward to write that in an aim. Phase 1 is not quite as hard, in my opinion, because you're typically only looking at toxicity or safety, and or tolerability, or perhaps you're picking between, maybe you're doing like a dose finding study based on those parameters. So as long as you have what you're measuring very clearly defined, and what you are comparing, what your rule is to move forward, your no-go rule, basically, then it should be easy to translate that into a specific aim. But it does depend on you having a well-designed study. So I think the design comes first, and then you can write the aim. And sometimes it's an iterative process. I don't know if Robert, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously the biggest, the project specific limitations are that if it's not a study that has, if it's just an underpowered study of something that doesn't really matter, or a powered study of something that adequately powered study of something that doesn't really matter, there's no saving it with a specific aims page, right? I mean, the project has to be exciting, worthwhile, and scientifically important in order to write a good specific aims page that adequately communicates that to the reviewer. If it's, I think this gets to phase 2 space being the hardest, because I think we've traditionally had phase 2 trials be not very well suited toward their phase. That is, a lot of phase 2 trials are underpowered phase 3 trials, and that's not useful. So what you really need to do for phase 2, in the way that, you said it exactly, is the design comes first, is you have to say, what is it that I can learn in this phase 2 space that's really important, that I'll be able to know with, enough certainty to move forward. And if you can find the right trial, the right question, then you can still write a good specific aims page. But if it really is, I wanted to do a phase 3 trial. I think I know everything that I need to know, but no one's going to give me a phase 3 trial unless I do a phase 2 trial first. So here's my underpowered phase 2 trial. It's going to be really hard to write a specific aims page that's convincing on that. So sometimes it needs to be a bigger phase 2 trial. That's maybe what what the right answer is, or it needs to involve a methodology that will let you focus in, because really, we go into later phase trials usually with too much uncertainty, right? There should be a lot of use for phase 2 trials because so many phase 3 trials depend on assumptions that we'd like to have more data for. So that's what you need to figure out. Phase 1 is maybe a little easier because phase 1 is, we're gonna do this to people who have never had anything like this done to them before and see if they all, dance and sing or die.
Next question is, please could you elaborate on the dependency or lack of dependency of the aims?
Yeah, that's a common question. So it's there's a common teaching I was always taught that the aims all have to be entirely independent of each other. That if that it's a fatal flaw if aim 2 says once we've discovered what we learned for phase 1, we'll go on and do this other experiment to develop it further. I think that I was always taught that. I don't think it makes sense. I think you'd like them to be independent if you can, but they're, especially in clinical trials, they're hardly going to be independent. I think the biggest risk is that if the reason that it was always taught that way is that, and this is especially true not in clinical trials usually as much as it is in basic science trials. If your first thing is we're going to find out whether this molecular receptor shows up in these patients, and then we're going to aim to characterize the receptor further, then you could end up with a huge part of the proposed work not being able to be done because the specific aim 2 depended on specific aim 1. If it doesn't happen, what are you going to spend the rest of the grant on? So that's where that comes from. In trials, usually you're going to spend the whole trial collecting the data, and the different aims are going to be different looks at the same data or different aspects of the same patients. So the dependency is less of an issue. It's more of an issue when it's a time sequence problem. The fact that nobody cares about safety if efficacy, if aim 1 is efficacy and aim 2 is safety, and no one's going to care about safety if efficacy isn't proven, I don't think that's a real risk. I don't think that's a big problem, even though it's a form of dependency. I don't know, Jordan, what do you?
No, I agree with that entirely, Robert. I think that comes from, basic science where you have this over, one hypothesis that leads to the next study that you're going to do. And it's not really like that with clinical trials. It's, as you said, you're basically doing the study, and then you have these different analyses that you will be doing with the data. And obviously safety, like you said, is not relevant if it's not efficacious, but I mean, the subgroup, since that's where your exploratory aim might actually help you, I guess, in that context, because you could look and see if there were subgroups that it did work in or something like that.
There are no more questions in the Q&A. If anybody would like to ask a question live, please feel free to raise your hand.
If you want, I can also share that PDF of the examples if that's helpful to people. Usually there are a lot more questions. I mean, I'll throw out some other observations that I see from time to time. You do want part of that, so I guess a couple statements about what goes into the introduction and then the statement of purpose. In terms of the introduction and statement of purpose, you do want to sell people on what's important and unique about your project. There are some things that you really don't need to start with that are always a little troublesome to me. If you're, submitting a grant to NSDK and you want to say that, stroke is important or traumatic brain injury is important, and there are a lot of strokes and there are a lot of traumatic brain injuries in the United States, you don't need to start with that. People are going to come in knowing that stroke and traumatic brain injury and epilepsy and that these are big serious problems. What you want to start with is the aspect or niche that you're studying about this and why that niche is important, because people might not know that. If you're studying a rare disease that no one's heard of, that maybe even reviewers on the panel haven't heard of, that then you can start with that disease is more prevalent than you think, or it's maybe rare but devastating. And but don't, I hate being on a panel where I'm reading 10 reviews of stroke trials and they're all telling me that there are a lot of strokes. I know there's a lot of strokes. In the statement of purpose thing, one of the things that I see missing a lot is people selling themselves, right? So even though the application is going to say some other things, I like to see in the statement of purpose. So that's why we need to solve this problem. Here's this great idea that we have, and we have the ability to solve it with this problem because our team is a multidisciplinary team with a tremendous amount of experience. You can't say a lot in that statement of purpose, but there should be something in that statement of purpose how you're going to solve this problem. And if you're going to solve this problem, the statement of why you are the person to solve this problem is worthwhile. And I see missing quite a bit.
Great, it doesn't look like there are any more questions. If there are, feel free to put them in the Q&A or chat really quick. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and give you a few more minutes of your time back.
Usually there are a lot more questions. That's okay. I don't mind.
Well, just a few reminders for the CTMC webinar series. Our next webinar is going to be next Friday, May 27th, and this is an open forum Q&A with our course directors. And I'm sorry, Dr. Silbergleit, I think I cut you off.
No.
I would just say, look very closely at those ICE-CAP specific aims that Dr. Silbergleit wrote. They led to a lot of grant funding when you count both the adult and pediatric ICE-CAP studies.
That I wrote with Dr. Moyer.
That you wrote with Dr. Moyer and with Dr. Moeller in pediatric.
And with Sharon Yates and
Ramesh and Romer and Alexis.
And for those of you that joined a little late, I just reposted in the chat the link to our webinar website where you will find this recording posted by next week, as well as the link to our survey to give us feedback. And we'd like to extend a very sincere thank you to Dr. Silbergleit and Dr. Elm. We really appreciate your time and presentation.
Our pleasure. Bye.
All right, well, thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.